Matt McElligott came to visit Pine Road School in October, and our 4th and 5th grade students had lots of questions for him. Matt McElligott is the author of such books as Benjamin Frankenstein Lives, Benjamin Frankenstein Meets the Fright Brothers, Benjamin Frankenstein Meets Thomas Edison, Backbeard and the Birthday Suit, Backbeard, Pirate for Hire, The Lion's Share, Bean 13, Even Monsters Need Haircuts, and Even Aliens Need Snacks.
Do you like writing books?
Is that a moose on your shirt?
Scooby-Doo.
Scooby-Doo, yeah. I do like writing books a lot. I think it's so much fun. What could be more fun than being able to come up with ideas in your mind and make up stories and then have someone pay you for it? It's pretty cool. Do you like to write stories, make up stories? Yeah, what do you make up stories about? About your life. Sort of like what happens to you in adventures and things like that. And how about you? What's your question?
What are the new books that you were going to publish?
New books. Well, I just came out with 2 just came out. Even Aliens Need Snacks and Benjamin Frankenstein Meets Thomas Edison. And I'm working on a new story that I hope will become a series about a robot. That's what I'm working on right now. Do you like robots? Would you want to have a robot someday?
Yeah.
Like, what would, if you had a robot, what would you ask the robot to do for you?
The chores.
That's a good idea. I'm not pretty smart.
How old were you when you wrote your
What?
first book?
This is serious. Don't smile.
How old were you when you wrote your first book?
What's your question?
How old were you when you wrote your first book?
That's a good question. I was about, well, the first book I ever remember writing, I was in like kindergarten or 1st grade. But the first book I ever had published, I think I started writing it when I was 24 and it came out when I was about 26. How about you? When did you write your first book?
When I was in like 1st grade, when I was like 8.
What was it about?
Jonas Brothers concert.
The Donut Brothers concert? Who are the Donut Brothers?
The Jonas Brothers concert.
Oh, I thought you said the Donut Brothers. Now that is a book I would want to read. Can you imagine the Donut Brothers? That would be a great book. No? You're a tough one. What is your question?
What would be your next book in the series of Benjamin Frankenstein?
Well, I don't know if there is going to be another one, but Larry and I talked about this idea we wanted to do. We thought it would be interesting. We had a couple ideas. We could bring back Marie Curie, or we could do Benjamin Frankenstein meets Marie Animated Curie, or we could bring back George Washington Carver, and he could be George Washington Cadaver. That's a dead body. Or the one that we were thinking about that would be really fun would be to bring back Albert Einstein. And we could do Benjamin Frankenstein meets Albert Frank Einstein. And they could do something with time travel. And wouldn't it be great if Victor had a chance to go back in time to see what Ben's world was like? We thought that would be really fun. So maybe someday, if there's more books like that, that's what they might be about. Does that sound good? Do you have any ideas for what the next one should be? Abraham Lincoln. And what would happen in that one? Find out who really killed him. That's a great idea. Can I steal that? Okay, I'm taking that. Thank you. Who's going to go first? You? Okay, you go first. Okay, you go first. What's your question?
How old were you when you started writing books?
And what's your question?
When did you start writing your books?
So it's kind of the same question, right? Well, my mother found a story that I wrote when I was in kindergarten. So that, to me, is the earliest story that I can ever remember writing. The first book I ever had published, I think that I started work on that when I was 24, and I think it came out when I was like 26 or 27, so it was around there. Do you two write? You like to write stories? How old were you when you wrote your first story?
I think I was in 2nd grade.
2nd grade, and how old were you? 2nd grade. Very good. Very good. Because somebody may ask you that someday. Oh, we're rolling. What's your question for me?
What is your favorite kind of book to read?
I like to write, generally the books I like to write are the same kind of books I like to read. And I like to read stories that are sort of adventure stories that are also funny. That's my favorite type. What's your favorite kind of book to read? Yeah, but what type? Like, do you like mysteries or books about like kids, or what do you like? You like mysteries. Okay, good. And what's your question?
How did you come up with your titles? They're creative.
Well, thank you. Sometimes the title comes first, like the Backbeard books or Benjamin Frankenstein started with a title and then went from there. Other times, the title is the last thing I came up with. So for Being 13 or The Lion's Share or Absolutely Not, I had already written the book before I figured out what the title was going to be. So it depends. What's your favorite title of any book you've ever read?
Lemonade War.
That is a good title. Lemonade War. I'd read that. Are you nervous? Are you nervous? Why don't we start with you then?
Okay. What inspired you to write your books?
What inspired me to write my books, and what's your question?
What got you started writing?
It's a good question. It's kind of the same question, aren't they? I think there were a lot of things that inspired me to write, but one of the things that I remember being really inspirational was the books that I read. I don't know if you ever had this experience when you finish reading a book, and then when you're done, it makes you really excited about wanting to sit down and write, to try and do it yourself, right? I remember reading a story called The Fantastic Mr. Fox by Roald Dahl. Do you know that one?
Yeah.
Okay. I love that story. And when it was done, I felt terrible, because the story was over and I knew I would never find out what happened next with those characters. So you know what I did? I don't know if you've ever tried this. I took out a piece of paper and I started to write a new story with those characters about what would happen next. And in doing that, I was able to bring those characters back to life. And I realized that what I was doing was the same thing that Roald Dahl was doing when he wrote the story. He just had a pencil and a piece of paper, and I had words, and he had words and nouns and verbs and everything else. He maybe put them together a little better than I did. But I realized that's all it was. That's all you need to be an author. So you need a pencil and paper, and you need some words and some ideas. That was really exciting to realize that, and I've been writing ever since. You guys like to write?
Yeah.
Do you? Do you? What do you write about? Anything? What do you like to read about? Anything. Is there anything that you would never write about? Would you write about zombie robots on the moon? Okay. All right. I would.
Do you have any kids?
Yes, I have one son. His name is Anthony. He's 15 years old.
How many drafts of Human Aliens Need Snacks have you made?
How many drafts did I make of that story? Wow. I did a lot of drafts of that story, because that story was all different kinds of things. At one point it was about the boy going to visit aliens on another planet. At one point the boy was a babysitter for aliens. There were all different versions of the story that I tried out before I ended up with the one. I probably did it at least 15 different times. When you write stories, do you go back and fix them and change them?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you like that part?
Yeah. Well, not really.
Not really.
Sometimes.
It's hard. Do you like to write stories?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you when you write the stories, are you good at going back and fixing them
Yeah.
and making the changes? It's a hard thing to do.
That's not.
You don't think so? You don't mind going back and finding the mistakes and fixing it?
I do, but it's not hard.
Not hard. Yeah. It makes the story better, doesn't it?
What got you interested in being an author?
What got me interested in being an author? There were a lot of things, but I think maybe mostly it was the books I read when I was growing up. The books, I don't know, have you ever read a book that was so interesting and exciting that you completely just forgot what you were and you lost yourself in that book? I love that feeling. And I always wanted to see if I could do that too. And that's what got me so excited about writing. What book did that for you? First Harry Potter. Good. Good question.
Where do you write your books?
Where do I write my books? It depends. I have a studio in my house that's for writing and drawing, but mostly I end up doing my writing. I'm on the road a lot. I travel to different schools, and so I write. Sometimes I'll write in my hotel room. Sometimes I'll stop at a coffee shop somewhere and sit down and do some writing. I always have my laptop with me. So I write wherever I can, and it's not always the same place. Do you like to write? Where do you like to write when you write? do you have a special desk for writing? That sounds fun. Isabella. Yes. Is that a Spanish name or an Italian?
It's Portuguese.
Portuguese? I'm Portuguese. My mother's side of the family is Portuguese.
My dad's Portuguese.
High five. Awesome.
What's your favorite book out of the 3 Ben Frankenstein?
That's a hard one. I like the first one because it was the first one we did. And I like the third one because of the way it ends. But maybe the second one because I think maybe the second one had the best mix of everything in it. Is that a good answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are you gonna?
Do you have a question for me? What does your shirt say?
Mr. Know-it-all.
Are you Mr. Know-it-all? Then how come you have a question if you know it all? Ha-ha! Aha! I gotcha. But you have a question anyway, don't you? Okay.
Are you gonna include George Washington in your next book?
That's a good question. And you have a follow-up to that?
Yeah, the reason we ask is because George Washington did make a mill where horses trampled wheat.
Okay. So he was an inventor.
Yes.
So he could belong. Oh, that's interesting. We don't have plans for George Washington, although we have thought about George Washington Carver, the African-American inventor who did all those things with peanuts. But although George Washington isn't in the story, I think Ben does talk about him a couple times in the books. So he is kind of in there, even though he's not one of the inventors we bring back. And you have a different question, too.
Yes.
Because you don't know it all. Right. Oh. What's your question?
Who was your idol author when you were growing up?
Oh, boy, that's a tough question, because there were a lot of good authors out there. I loved so many different authors, but probably the author who I read more than any other author and still read is a man named Daniel Pinkwater. And I think he writes some of the funniest, most interesting, most exciting stories that I've ever read. And the really weird stories about weird, funny kids like I was when I was growing up. I think that's why I like him so much. But you guys aren't weird, funny kids, right?
Funny but not weird.
Funny but not weird. I was funny and weird. Mostly weird. Who are you? Joy? That's a great name. What's your question?
Did you like writing when you were younger?
I did. I liked writing a lot. Although I have to say that my favorite thing was drawing. When given the choice, I would always be drawing, and then sometimes I would make up stories that would go along with the pictures I drew. What do you like better, writing or drawing?
How many drafts did you do before you wrote you did your final copy of a picture book?
So how many drafts do I do when I'm working on a picture book? And what's your question?
How many drafts did you do before you made the final copy of Benjamin Franklin's Time Meets the Four Brothers?
Which is a longer book. How many drafts do I do before I do a middle grade book or a chapter book? And you know, the answer is kind of the same. Usually I'll do, I don't know, anywhere from 10 to 20 different drafts. You know, the drafts are different for a longer book because I don't rewrite the entire book each time. Larry and I write it together. But I'll rewrite maybe a chapter or paragraphs or things like that. Sometimes with the picture books, because it has less words, I'll rewrite the entire story, sometimes 10 or 15 times. But there's a lot of rewriting. I probably spend the same amount of time, anywhere from 6 months to a year, rewriting and fixing the story sometimes, getting it just where it needs to be.
Because I really don't like doing drafts, and now I'm imagining how many drafts you do.
Well, I didn't used to like it either. It's because nobody wants to go back and find your mistakes. But what I find is when I do that, if I make myself do that, the stories come out so much better. And if I do something where I don't go back and I fix the mistakes, then later on I go back and look at it and I wish I had. So it's hard, but it's so worth it in the end. You're very shiny today. Your pants are shiny. You're shiny all over. You're the shiniest kid I've seen all day. You're welcome. What's your question? Are you sure? Are you Haley?
I have one.
Who are you?
Lena.
Okay. Hi, Haley.
Hi.
What's your question?
What got you into making the Benjamin Frankenstein series?
Well, the idea originally came from my son, who was a big fan of Franklin the Turtle. And he kept getting Franklin the Turtle mixed up with Frankenstein the monster. So when he talked about Frankenstein, he would call him Franklinstein. And that made me imagine like Benjamin Franklin plus Frankenstein's monster, like combining to make this crazy sort of reanimated founding father. And that's where the idea came from. I stole it from my son. Let's say it was inspired from my son. I didn't really steal it from him. Does that make sense? Okay. Haley, what's your question?
I'm not Haley.
You sure? I thought you said you were Haley.
I said she was Haley.
Okay. Well, what's your question? I thought it was Haley's turn. I'm sorry. Okay. Yes. What's your question?
How did you come up with exciting topics to fit in with already has happened in the Benjamin Frankenstein books?
You mean like after a bunch of stuff happened, how do we figure out what would happen next? Well, from the very beginning, we had an idea for how all three stories would go in a very general way. But then figuring out the little details of each adventure, that was the process of writing the book. So Larry and I, my co-writer, he's a good friend of mine, we would get together and sometimes we would just sit on the porch in the summer for hours and just toss out different ideas and make notes and try combining different things together. And the trick was whatever we came up with in the later books had to fit with everything we'd written in the earlier books as well. And sometimes that was tricky. Good. It's nice to meet you, Riley. And you're all dressed in pink today. Did you two call each other before school? Okay. What's your question?
What was your first book?
First book I ever had published, it was a book called The Truth About Cousin Ernie's Head. And it came out, what year were you born? 2003. It came out almost 10 years before you were born. It's a long time ago. It's like the Ice Ages. And what's your question?
How long does it take for you to write one book?
Well, it depends. Usually from when I get the idea until the book is finally finished and it's on the shelves of the libraries, it's between 2 and 3 years to do a book. It's a while. What grade are you in? Fourth grade. So if you started work on a book today, and you really worked hard on it, and you had to go through all the things about publishing it and everything else, it might be finished by the time you're in 6th grade. It's a long time. That's a good question. You had to think about that. You sure that's your name?
Yes.
You sure? Do you have some ID, like a driver's license or something? Okay. What's your question? Michelle?
Misha.
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 Misha. How do you spell that?
M-I-S-H.
That's a beautiful name. What's your question?
Do you like writing books for kids?
I like writing books for kids. It's the kids I don't like. I don't like children at all. I think of children as small monsters. You're not one of those children, are you?
No.
You're not. So you're not sure of your name. You don't know if you're a child. Who are you really? To be honest, I love writing books for kids. In fact, sometimes I think grown-up books are too serious. And I think the things that you can write about in books for kids, like robots and monsters and aliens, that's the fun stuff to write about. That's why I like it. And I really do like kids, too. It's just true. That's again. Take 2? Okay. Why are you here?
Because I have to ask you a question.
You have to ask me a question. You don't want to, but you have to.
No, I want to.
You want to ask me a question. Okay, what is your question?
What inspired you to write Bean 13 and Lion Share?
Well, each one was a little different. I'll tell you about Bean 13. Bean 13 came about because I was reading about the history of numbers and a history of why certain numbers are unlucky numbers. Do you think of, is 13 an unlucky number to you? Do you think, like, if you get the number 13 in a game or something like that is an unlucky number for you? I don't think so either. In fact, my initials are MM, and M is the 13th letter of the alphabet. So it's always been good for me. So that was a story about why 13 is unlucky, and it all has to do with prime numbers and all kinds of things like that. But and the lion's share came about after a birthday party I had when we had this really good birthday cake. Really good birthday cake. And after we were all done, there was still one piece left, and nobody wanted to take the last piece of cake, so they started cutting off pieces of it, and as they did, the cake got smaller and smaller, and I thought, there's a good idea for a story in there somewhere. Do you like cake? What is your favorite cake to eat?
Red velvet.
I like that. I never think about that one. That's a good cake.
Will you include any other
Hair
famous
is
people?
really sharp. You could cut bread with your hair.
Yeah.
Do you ever do that? Just put some bread on your head and just slice the bread.
Yeah.
Make toast.
Got it in all my hair, but still sliced it.
That's a good idea. What's your question for me?
Will you include any other famous people in your books?
Well, we've thought about it, and in the third book, because in the story there's this secret organization, the Modern Order of Prometheus, and they bring inventors back from the dead. And in the third book, which I bet you haven't read yet, it's just came out, there's a list of many of the other inventors who were preserved over the years. And some of the ones are ones you might expect, and there's a couple that I bet would be surprises to you.
Okay.
Good question.
Thanks.
How do you?
Do you have any good ideas for books? Like, do you have an idea for a good story?
Yeah.
You do? What is it?
Oh,
Whisper it to me. Oh, I see. That's good. Okay, what's your question?
How do you get your ideas for your books?
I ask her. She tells me. I'm just joking. Wouldn't it be amazing if that was true? If all my ideas came from her and I just called her up and said, give me an idea for a book. No, my ideas come from all different places. Sometimes it'll be something somebody says. Sometimes it'll be something I read about, I was reading about, like the history of math, which is really weird. And that gave me the idea for being 13. And the idea for the lion's share came from some birthday cake that we had at my birthday party. So ideas can come from anywhere. Does that make sense? But mostly from her. What's your question?
Is it hard writing books?
Sometimes. Sometimes it's really hard. Sometimes it's hard to come up with the idea, or do you guys like to draw?
Yeah.
Do you ever have that, like you sit down to draw something and you think you know how it's going to look, and you start drawing and then it doesn't quite look right, and you erase it and you try drawing it again and it still doesn't work, and you erase it like 50 times and it still doesn't work. It's so frustrating, right? I've been doing this for a lot of years, and that still happens to me too, all the time. But I will say this, just because it's hard doing books doesn't mean it's not also really fun. So I have a lot of fun doing it. Sometimes the things that are the hardest turn out to be the most fun in the long run. How are you two today?
Good.
Good. Do you have some questions for me?
Yeah.
Okay, I want you to tell them to me at exactly the same time. Go!
What book do you think is the best? What's your favorite thing to do besides reading books?
Okay. Which book is the best? And what's my favorite thing to do besides writing books? I'll start with this one. I don't have one favorite thing to do. I have a lot of things. I like to travel. I like to play music. I like to go swimming. I like to do things with my family and play ball with my son and things like that. I have a lot of favorite things. What's your favorite thing to do when you're not reading books?
Watch TV.
Watch TV. And you asked me, what's my favorite book of all the books I've written?
Yeah.
That's a really hard question to answer, because each book has things that I really am very proud of, and has things that I kind of wish I could go back and change a little bit. So usually the book whatever book I'm working on at the moment, that's the book I'm most excited about. So that's the one that I would say, like, is my favorite at any given time. What's your favorite book? Of all books, no. Do you have a book that you like to go back and read over and over again? No. Do you have any book that you've ever read that you like at all?
Yeah.
Tell me one.
It's not so.
Snot Stew?
Yeah. It's like a game. It's a game. It's called Snot Stew, the game.
Really?
Yeah.
I would read that. That sounds good.
If you would like to learn more about Matt McElligott and his books, go to MatthewMcElligott.com. We'd like to thank Matt for coming to visit our school and sharing his time with us.